The night was silent in Alba, Texas, a rural patch of East Texas where people didn't lock their doors and still waved at neighbors from porches. It was March 1st, 2008, and the small town slept soundly under a thick blanket of darkness, unaware that within the walls of one home, a nightmare was about to unfold. Inside that house lived the Caffey family, Terry and Penny, and their 3 children. Erin, the bright 16-year-old girl, Matthew, age 13, and little Tyler, just 8. To anyone who knew them, the Caffeys were a portrait of normal, devout Christian life. Terry was a preacher and musician, Penny sang in the church choir, and their children were raised with strict moral guidelines and deep roots in faith. But behind the hymns and Sunday morning smiles, a storm had been brewing. A storm born not from outside threats, but from within, one fueled by rebellion, obsession, and teenage rage. Erin Caffey had once been a sweet, obedient daughter. Her parents were protective but loving. They homeschooled her and kept her away from what they considered corrupt influences. But Erin, like most teenagers, began to crave independence. That desire found its spark when she met Charlie Wilkinson, an older boy with a bad boy charm. He smoked, carried a rebellious confidence, and offered Erin the kind of attention she never received under the sheltered roof of her family's home. Erin fell fast and hard, and when Terry and Penny began to notice the shift in her behavior, the secret texts, the sneaking around, the defiance, they intervened. They told Erin to end the relationship. For them, it was about love and discipline. For Erin, it was war. To Charlie, Erin wasn't just a girlfriend, she was an obsession. He told his friends he was going to imperil her, that she was his everything. And when Erin's parents stepped in to stop their relationship, it wasn't just a minor setback. To Charlie, it was personal. And Erin? Instead of resisting, she leaned into it. She began to fantasize with Charlie about a future free of restrictions. No more homeschooling, no more bedtime curfews, no more parents to control her life. What started as teenage rebellion twisted into something darker. Conversations shifted from complaints to planning. Planning not how to run away, but how to erase the problem entirely. They were joined by 2 more, Charles Wade, a friend of Charlie's, and Bobby Johnson, Charles's girlfriend. They were young, reckless, and intoxicated by the thrill of what they were about to do. Erin didn't need to force them. She just needed to suggest. They were more than willing to be part of the plan. As the night of the attack approached, Erin's role was simple. She'd leave the front door unlocked. Her parents would be sleeping inside. Her little brothers too. She wouldn't have to do the killing. But she knew what was going to happen. She knew exactly who the targets were, and she was ready. Around 2:00 a.m., Charlie, Charles, and Bobby crept toward the Caffey home. The night was still. Erin had done her part. The door was open. Inside, Penny and Terry were asleep. Tyler and Matthew were in their bedrooms. What followed was a massacre. Charlie Wilkinson carried a .22 caliber gun and a samurai sword. Charles Wade brought a knife. They moved through the home like hunters. Penny was the first to die. Shot in the head. Terry was next. Shot 5 times, but somehow survived, dragging himself out of the burning home later. The fire had been set to cover up the evidence. But the worst part, the most chilling, was what happened to the boys. Matthew, just 13, was stabbed repeatedly. Tyler, only 8 years old, was nearly decapitated with the sword. The brutality wasn't just a silence, it was rage. Pure, unforgiving rage. And Erin? She wasn't inside. She wasn't covered in blood. She was waiting at a trailer a few miles away, sitting calmly with Bobby Johnson, waiting for Charlie and Charles to return. She knew her family was being murdered in that very moment, and yet she showed no panic, no fear, just silence. When the boys returned, they were bloodied, and the look on Erin's face wasn't horror, it was satisfaction. The plan had worked. But the fire didn't erase everything. Terry Caffey, against all odds, survived. Wounded and disoriented, he managed to crawl out of the burning house and across the yard to a neighbor's home. His survival was a miracle, and it would become the turning point in unraveling the horror. Police arrived at a crime scene so brutal, even hardened detectives were shaken. 2 boys mutilated, a mother shot in bed, a home burned to ash. But something didn't add up. The crime looked personal, emotional, and Terry, despite his agony, had one haunting recollection. He had seen someone tall with long hair. He was certain the attackers knew the family. The investigation moved quickly. Within hours, leads pointed toward Charlie Wilkinson. His name was already known to the family, and when police picked him up, the story unraveled almost immediately. He broke down, admitted everything, and led police to Erin. When detectives found her, she was calm, eerily calm, not a tear, not a tremble, just blankness, like someone watching a movie instead of living a tragedy. Erin was arrested. So were Charlie, Charles Wade, and Bobby Johnson. The charges were staggering: capital murder, arson, conspiracy. During the interrogation, Erin spoke not as a grieving daughter, but as a disappointed girl whose love had been forbidden. She admitted she was angry, that her parents were trying to ruin her relationship, that she wanted them gone. She never lifted a weapon, but she unlocked the door. She knew her mother would be shot. She knew her brothers would be killed. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She waited. The courtroom was a battlefield of emotion when the case went to trial. Terry Caffey sat in the front row, the only surviving member of the family, watching his daughter face the consequences of orchestrating the destruction of their home, the deaths of his wife and sons. He had once changed her diapers, taught her to pray, walked her through scripture. Now he watched as she was described as the mastermind of a family massacre. Prosecutors painted her as cold, calculated, and vengeful. Defense attorneys claimed she was manipulated, emotionally abused by Charlie Wilkinson, and not capable of fully understanding the gravity of what she had set in motion. But the facts were chilling: the unlocked door, the knowledge of the plan, the calm demeanor, the lack of remorse. In the end, Erin took a plea deal. She was spared the death penalty and sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 25 years, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade were sentenced to life without parole. Bobby Johnson, whose role was more passive but nonetheless complicit, also received a lengthy sentence. The public was stunned, not just by the brutality, but by the youth of the perpetrators. Erin was just 16. Charlie was 18. They weren't hardened criminals. They were kids. Kids who, in one night, extinguished an entire family. But for Terry Caffey, the aftermath was more complex than grief. He had lost his wife, his 2 sons, his home, and perhaps most tragically, he had lost his daughter, not to death, but to darkness. Yet in the years that followed, Terry chose forgiveness. In interviews and his own writings, he spoke of God's mercy, of letting go of anger, and of finding peace even in devastation. He visited Erin in prison, hugged her, spoke with her, not as a killer, but as his daughter. His belief in redemption never wavered, even when others couldn't understand how he could offer grace to someone who helped murder his family. He said holding on to hate would only kill what little was left of him. The Erin Caffey case remains one of the most chilling examples of family betrayal in modern American history. Not just for its brutality, but for the psychological questions it leaves behind. How does a teenager go from singing in church pews to plotting murder? How does love become so warped that it justifies annihilation? Erin wasn't possessed. She wasn't insane. She was just angry, in love, and believed, in her teenage mind, that life would be better if her parents were dead. That kind of darkness doesn't arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, watered by resentment, rebellion, and the thrill of control. The house in Alba is long gone. The flames that consumed it also tried to erase the truth, but the story didn't burn away. It remains chilling and sharp, a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers, but from the very children we raise, love, and trust. The flames that tore through the Caffey home did more than take lives. They incinerated the future Terry had imagined for his family. When he awoke in the hospital, bandaged and burned, tubes down his throat and pain screaming through every nerve, it wasn't the physical agony that overwhelmed him. It was the silence, the absence of his wife's gentle voice, the laughter of his boys, the warmth of his home. He didn't yet know that only he had survived. When the sheriff finally stood beside his hospital bed, Unable to look him in the eye, Terry understood. Everything he had lived for had died in one night, and then, as if that loss wasn't cruel enough, came the revelation that his daughter had been behind it all. He refused to believe it at first. Erin, his little girl, the one who read Bible verses before dinner and played piano on Sunday mornings. The idea was too monstrous. But as the hours passed and the facts emerged, her secret texts with Charlie, the unlocked door, the plan discussed with witnesses, reality turned colder than the grave. His daughter had planned his execution. She had stood by as her mother, her brothers, were slaughtered like animals. And for what? A boy who didn't know the meaning of love. A rebellion dressed up as romance. There's no pain more intimate than being betrayed by your own blood. Terry had survived bullets and fire, but this truth, this cold, merciless truth, nearly killed him. In the days after the crime, investigators combed through Erin's life. They examined her emails, text messages, MySpace conversations. What they found was a girl spiraling long before that night. Erin had become increasingly volatile in the months leading up to the murders. Her relationship with Charlie had turned obsessive. She wrote him poems about eternity, about being together no matter what, and about how her parents were destroying their love. In one message she wrote, "I want them gone, all of them." Prosecutors would later read that line aloud in court. It wasn't just a fantasy, it was a mission. Charlie Wilkinson, on the other hand, wasn't some brilliant manipulator. He was immature, impulsive, and violent. He'd boasted to friends about doing something big. He told them Erin was his soulmate, that they were being kept apart by her evil parents. And yet, even with all his bravado, when the interrogation lights hit his face and he was shown the photos of what they'd done, he broke. He cried. He begged. He told detectives he only did it for Erin, that he thought he was proving his love, that he didn't want to lose her. But what kind of love demands murder? Charles Wade and Bobby Johnson were less directly involved in the killings, but they were no less complicit. Charles helped carry out the plan, stabbing Matthew and taking part in the arson. Bobby waited with Erin in the car, fully aware of what was happening inside the house. She never called 911, never objected, and when asked why, she simply said she didn't think it would really happen, but it had happened, and now they were all facing a future behind bars. At the center of it all stood Erin. She didn't cry during the interviews. She didn't flinch when detectives told her how her brothers had died. She sat with an eerie detachment, her voice soft, almost childlike. Some investigators believed she was in shock. Others thought she was a sociopath. One seasoned detective later said, "I've sat across from killers before, but something about that girl gave me chills. It was like there was nothing behind her eyes. And yet she wasn't a monster in appearance. She was petite, quiet, almost meek. That's what made it so horrifying. The disconnect between how she looked and what she had done." As the legal proceedings began, the town of Alba found itself divided. Some believed Erin had been brainwashed by Charlie, that she was young, emotionally manipulated, and driven by teenage desperation. Others saw her as the mastermind, a wolf in sheep's clothing, who used her innocence to hide a venomous desire for control. The prosecution didn't need to prove she pulled the trigger. Under Texas law, someone who helps plan a capital murder can face the same punishment as those who commit it. Erin's fingerprints weren't on the sword or the gun, but her signature was on the motive. She had opened the gate to hell and watched as it swallowed her family. Her defense team pushed for a deal. Life with parole eligibility after 40 years. It was a heavy sentence, but it spared her the death penalty. Charlie Wilkinson received life without parole. Charles Wade did too. Bobby Johnson, after testifying and cooperating, received 40 years with parole eligibility. But what haunted people most wasn't the legal outcome. It was the chilling realization that none of this had to happen. This wasn't a case of abuse or desperation or poverty. This was about control, about wanting something and deciding that anyone who stood in the way deserved to die. In prison, Erin Caffey has become something of a ghost. No interviews, no public statements, just silence. She's been described by guards as quiet, polite, compliant, but her presence still chills those who remember the case. A 16-year-old girl plotted the slaughter of her entire family. And for many, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many years she serves, that sin is too great to forgive. But Terry Caffey did forgive her. That's the part of the story that many people struggle to understand. He visited her in prison. He hugged her. He sat across the table from the girl who had arranged the murder of his wife and sons. And he chose grace. He spoke at churches, on television, to grieving families. And he said the same thing every time. Hate will destroy you. It already destroyed most of my family. I won't let it take what's left. Terry moved away from Alba, remarried, and tried to rebuild a life from ashes. But the loss never left him. He wrote a book called Terror by Night, recounting the horror of that evening and the spiritual battle that followed. In it, he talked about how he nearly took his own life after the murders, about how he loaded a gun, put it to his head, and was seconds away from pulling the trigger. But something, maybe faith, maybe instinct, stopped him. He said a voice inside him reminded him that he had survived for a reason, that he wasn't supposed to die that night. He was supposed to live and tell the story, not to inspire hate, but to warn others what darkness can grow when love is denied, when anger goes unchecked, when the line between rebellion and destruction vanishes. Today, the burned-out remains of the Caffey home are long gone. The lot was cleared. Grass grew where blood once soaked into the floor. But in the town's memory, that night never really ended. Neighbors still remember the sirens, the smell of smoke, the funerals, the shock that a girl they had seen playing in the church choir had been part of something so evil. They remember the broken man who walked into the church days later, without his family, and tried to sing the same hymns that once echoed from his front porch. Erin Caffey will be eligible for parole when she's in her 50s. Whether she'll ever be free again is uncertain. Whether she deserves to be is debated. But what's undeniable is that her story remains one of the most harrowing family betrayals in American history. Not because it was gruesome, but because it was personal. Because it came from within. In the years that followed the murders, the town of Alba tried to move on, but small towns don't forget easily. The story of the Caffey family wasn't just a tragedy. It was a ghost that lingered in every corner, every church pew, every grocery store conversation whispered between tight-lipped locals. People who had once known Erin as a sweet church girl now struggled to reconcile her with the mastermind of a triple murder. Her friends, her teachers, her neighbors all questioned themselves. Had they missed something? Had there been signs? Could someone really harbor so much rage and hide it behind a smile? These were the questions that kept the community restless long after the ashes had settled. The media had swarmed the case from the moment the arrests were made. Headlines described Erin as the teen girl who ordered her family's murder. Tabloids feasted on the story. A seemingly innocent high school girl turned evil, a Romeo and Juliet gone psychotic. But the real story was more complex. Erin wasn't an archetype. She wasn't a monster with glowing red eyes. She was just a girl, and maybe that's what made her actions even more terrifying. The ordinariness. The sheer possibility that someone who sat beside you in school, who said grace at dinner, who kissed her little brothers goodnight, could be capable of orchestrating their slaughter. Her face was everywhere. News broadcasts, internet forums, true crime shows. Some people were enraged, others obsessed. A few, disturbingly, even admired her. That's the strange thing about infamous criminals. Notoriety brings attention, and attention brings fascination. Erin received fan letters in jail. Some young men even offered to marry her. They saw her not as a killer, but as misunderstood, as a symbol of rebellion. It was sickening, but not uncommon in the world of high-profile killers. And yet Erin herself never sought that spotlight. She gave no televised interviews, wrote no manifestos. She seemed to recede into herself, as if she too were haunted by what she had done. Only a few people ever got close enough to see what was left of Erin Caffey. One of them was Terry, her father, the man she had condemned to die. He continued to visit her. He said he saw glimpses of the girl she once was, that she was remorseful, that she cried, that she told him again and again how sorry she was. And maybe she meant it. Maybe part of her still couldn't fully understand what she had done. After all, she was 16, young, foolish, intoxicated by love and desperation. But age doesn't erase accountability. Her actions were adult in their cruelty, in their finality. Whether she felt regret or not, 3 people were dead because of her. Terry's forgiveness baffled many. They asked how he could sit across from her without rage burning through his veins. His answer was always the same. Because hate didn't kill my family, love did. Twisted love. And I won't let hate finish the job. It wasn't that he forgot. It wasn't that he excused. He simply refused to carry the weight of vengeance. He had seen where that path led. He had seen what happens when love turns into something poisonous. In time, Terry moved forward. He remarried a woman who helped him rebuild his life. They had a child together. He never stopped mourning Penny, Matthew, and Tyler. They were carved into his soul, but he found purpose again. He traveled the country telling his story. He spoke at prisons, churches, schools. He warned parents about the dangers of emotional isolation. He urged teenagers to speak up, to seek help, to understand that choices, even at 16, can last a lifetime. He wasn't a preacher in a pulpit anymore. He was a survivor with a message, and people listened. But while Terry rebuilt, the other figures in the story faded into shadows. Charlie Wilkinson, now serving life without parole, disappeared from headlines. His letters from prison revealed a man who was still deeply obsessed with Erin years after the crime. He called her his soulmate. He blamed himself, yet simultaneously excused his actions as being blinded by love. It was the same dangerous thinking that had started it all. The idea that love justified anything, even murder. Charles Wade, who had wielded the knife and set the house ablaze, showed no public remorse. He was quieter, more reserved. In court, he appeared indifferent, even annoyed, as though the trial was a burden, not a reckoning. He never apologized to Terry, never looked him in the eyes. Some say he was the most dangerous of them all, not because of what he did, but because of how little he seemed to care. And Bobby Johnson, who had waited outside in the car with Erin, was perhaps the most tragic follower in the group. She was young, impressionable, and clearly in over her head. But she had a choice that night. She could have called for help. She could have stopped them. Instead, she watched and did nothing. Her silence was complicity, and for that, she too would spend decades behind bars. As the years went by, people stopped talking about the cafe murders at the grocery store. New scandals, new crimes, new distractions replaced it. But every now and then, someone would drive past the empty lot where the house once stood, and the memory would return. The night the sky turned red and the air smelled of smoke and blood. They'd remember Terry's screams, the sirens, the fire trucks, the funeral procession with 3 caskets, and they'd remember the daughter who wasn't among them. In a rare statement, one prison counselor who worked with Erin described her as composed, reflective, but deeply broken. She said Erin often avoided eye contact, spoke softly, and clutched a worn Bible during group sessions. Some inmates saw her as aloof. Others feared her. One said, "You don't really talk to girls like that. You just know there's something off." Whether Erin found God in prison or simply clung to the last thing she had left from her past, no one can say for certain. But she did change, slowly. Not in a way that erased what she had done, but in a way that hinted at an understanding she never had at 16. She would never again be free. But maybe she had finally begun to understand what it meant to destroy a life. Not just her family's, but her own. What makes the Erin Caffey case so unforgettable isn't just the violence. It's the intimacy, the betrayal, the idea that danger didn't knock on the front door. It walked through it, barefoot and familiar. It slept under the same roof, wore the same last name, said "I love you" at bedtime. That kind of horror stays with you. It forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. How well do we really know the people closest to us? What lies behind a teenager's smile? What happens when love becomes entitlement? When control disguises itself as protection? And when the structure of a family becomes a cage? How far will someone go to break free? No one can undo what happened that night in March 2008. No amount of reflection, repentance, or punishment can bring back Penny, Matthew, and Tyler. The house will never be rebuilt. The innocence of that town never restored. But stories like this don't just fade away. They echo in homes, in schools, in parenting decisions, in conversations between fathers and daughters, mothers and sons. They remind us that the line between love and destruction is thinner than we like to admit, that the human heart, even when young, is capable of terrifying things. And in that echo, maybe there is a warning, a plea, to listen more, to see the cracks before they become fractures, to understand that beneath even the most angelic faces can lurk a darkness waiting to be fed. Time has passed. More than a decade now since that horrible night when everything changed, when the walls of a quiet Texas home were soaked in fire and blood. And yet, even as the calendar pages turn, the Erin Caffey case has never quite gone cold in America's collective memory. It has become a grim milestone, a story that surfaces again and again in documentaries, podcasts, and true crime retrospectives. But unlike some sensational stories that attract viewers simply for the gore or the courtroom drama, this one lingers because it feels so personal, so possible, so wrong in a way that's hard to look away from. Erin Caffey still sits in prison, now in her early 30s, having spent more years behind bars than she did in freedom. If she serves her full sentence, she won't even be eligible for parole until she's in her 50s. Middle-aged, far removed from the naive teenager who traded her family for a boyfriend. Her name has faded from headlines, but in the crime community, her legacy is eternal. She is studied now. She is referenced in psychology classes, criminal justice seminars, even theological discussions about evil and redemption. But in all that time, she has remained mostly silent. No full interviews. No public apologies broadcast to the world. Just the occasional reference from her father, Terry, or a passing mention in court filings or prison logs. Some people believe silence is her only way forward, that any attempt to explain, justify, or apologize would only reopen wounds, or worse, sound hollow. Because how does someone atone for the extermination of their own family? What words could possibly hold enough weight? I'm sorry doesn't reach deep enough. I was in love doesn't make the blood wash away. I was young doesn't resurrect the dead. Perhaps Erin knows this. Perhaps she understands that no redemption will come from the public, that the only redemption left to her is private, between her and God, or whatever version of herself still lives inside that prison cell. And what about Charlie Wilkinson, Charles Wade, Bobby Johnson? Their names have faded even faster. They've become shadows remembered only as tools in Erin's plan, and even that truth is complicated. Were they willing participants? Yes. Were they manipulated by Erin? Possibly, but they made their choices. They sharpened their blades. They walked into that home. They killed children in their beds. And no matter who asked them to, no matter who unlocked the door, their hands were the ones that ended lives. That's not a teenager's mistake. That's a lifelong stain. But beyond the prison walls, beyond the pages of case files and headlines, the most haunting legacy of the Caffey case lives on in the human heart, in the way it reshaped one man's soul. Terry Caffey didn't just survive a murder attempt. He survived an extinction of everything he loved. And yet somehow he rebuilt, slowly, painfully, piece by piece. He could have turned bitter, could have demanded death sentences, could have disappeared into rage. But instead he became a quiet symbol of a different kind of strength. The kind that forgives not because it forgets, but because it refuses to carry the burden of vengeance. Terry's message when he speaks publicly is not about Erin's guilt. He never denies what she did. He never sugarcoats the horror. But he also doesn't speak of her as a monster. He speaks of her as a broken person who made a choice so terrible that it shattered an entire world, and yet still his daughter, still the child he once held in his arms. Still someone whose soul, in his eyes, isn't beyond the reach of mercy. His choice to forgive doesn't sit well with everyone. Many call it naive or dangerous. Some say it sends the wrong message, that forgiveness means leniency. But Terry doesn't argue with those people. He doesn't ask them to understand. He simply lives with the choice he made because he knows what hate did to his family, and he knows he doesn't want to become its next victim. The Erin Caffey case is studied now not just as a murder, but as a phenomenon, a psychological, social, and moral enigma. Why do children commit such horrific acts against their own families? What turns anger into annihilation? What emotional fractures, what cultural influences, what relational neglects combine to create a person who thinks killing is the only escape? These are the questions criminologists ask. These are the patterns experts look for in hopes of prevention. But the scariest part is, sometimes there are no signs, no red flags that scream, just silence, just isolation, just a girl with a diary full of poetry and a heart full of resentment. And perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all, that evil doesn't always wear a villain's mask. Sometimes it wears pink pajamas, a choir dress, a teenage smile. Sometimes it says, "I love you," as it hands the knife to someone else. That kind of betrayal cannot be fully prepared for. It can only be understood in hindsight, and even then, never completely. The town of Alba has long since buried its dead. Penny, Matthew, and Tyler rest in quiet graves. The home where their laughter once echoed is gone. The church still sings, the seasons still change, and new families have moved in. But those who lived through that year still carry the weight. It taught them something they never wanted to learn, that evil can come from the most unexpected places, and that the people you trust most can sometimes be the ones who destroy you. Erin's name may one day be forgotten by new generations. The details of the case may be replaced by newer crimes, newer tragedies. But the emotions it stirred, the questions it raised, the shock it delivered, those will endure. Because this wasn't just a crime story, it was a warning, a mirror, a tragedy that whispered something we all fear, but rarely admit, that even love, if twisted hard enough, can kill. And maybe in telling this story,